infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, on Tuesday, the FDA approved Artesunate for injection for the treatment of severe malaria in adults and children. The treatment is manufactured and distributed by Maryland company Amivas. So joining me today to talk about severe malaria and the newly approved drug is Bryan Smith, MD. Dr. Smith is the Chief Medical Officer at Amivas. Dr. Smith, welcome to the show, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Harriman. Thank you so very much for having us and for your interest in Artesunate for injection. Okay.
Well, let me first off congratulate you on the approval of this very important drug, you and your team. So before we talk about the treatment itself, can you briefly explain to the audience what is severe malaria?
Certainly. So for those of us with no immunity to malaria, so non-immune travelers who went into a malarious area, if we're bitten by a mosquito that is carrying the malaria parasite, it will initiate the cascade of diseases which will ultimately end in severe malaria if one doesn't receive appropriate treatments. And so early on, people may feel like they have the flu and you have the typical fevers and chills and nausea. If that is left untreated, it continues to progress. And ultimately, it can end in a number of very serious conditions, which have been formalized by the WHO and other organizations into criteria that would classify it as severe, which would initiate a medical emergency and the necessity for a parenteral, so the IV therapy. So that could be cerebral malaria with impaired consciousness, seizures or coma, severe anemia, hemoglobinuria, with acute respiratory distress, abnormalities in blood coagulation, severe low blood pressure, acute kidney injuries, very, very high degrees of the percentage of red blood cells that contain parasites, particularly with the most lethal form, the Plasmodium falciparum, a metabolic acidosis, or a hypoglycemia. And one or more of those conditions would indicate severe malaria that would necessitate this intravenous treatment.
So how many cases of this do we see in the United States? It can't be that many, right?
No, it is an ultra-orphan neglected tropical disease within the United States context. Worldwide, severe malaria may cause a little more than 400,000 deaths. But total malaria in the United States on an average year from the CDC is approximately 2,400 cases, of which 10 to up to 15% would progress to become severe. And so you're left with roughly about 300 cases per year in the United States of the severe complicated malaria.
And then, of course, this is all imported malaria, too, because it's not contracted in the United States, right?
That is absolutely correct. So in the United States and in much of the developed world, it is considered an imported disease. Typically, it is from individuals that have immigrated to the United States. Perhaps they came from malarious areas and had some degree of semi-immunity, but have now lost that immunity. And so when they're going to visit relatives or friends, and perhaps not remembering to take appropriate malaria preventative medicines, then they can contract malaria and then bring it back into the United States.
So how is severe malaria being treated for prior to this approval?
It's a great question. So IV artesunate itself has been used worldwide for probably more than 20 years. and has been globally recognized as the standard of care for quite some time. Here within the United States, however, it has never received an approval. So the only drug that was officially approved for the intravenous treatment of severe malaria in the United States was a drug called quinidine. Quinidine was developed and used many years ago as a cardiac dysrhythmic drug, but it no longer has a place within the armamentarium for that use. And so the manufacturer elected to cease the production line of the medicine. And so when the last of the quinidine stocks in the United States expired in March of 2019, there was no therapeutic alternative left within the United States to treat these severe malaria patients. Critically, the U.S. Army had identified back in the 90s the need for this drug, and our colleagues at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research did the early development work, and then it was transferred into the Army's advanced development activity to complete the work. They developed and manufactured via good manufacturing practices IV Artesunate, which has been made available to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control for use in an expanded use treatment IND protocol since 2007. Since March then of 2019, the only therapeutic alternative for U.S. patients has been to receive that product through the CDC treatment IND. And that will continue for the next couple of months while Amivas finishes its commercialization activities, and then the distribution responsibilities then would revert to Amivas, and the CDC would no longer have to carry that responsibility.
Okay, so you're saying that ERs or pharmacies are going to start carrying this instead? So individual hospitals will need to make their own decisions depending upon what type of patient population they see. Mm-hmm. Because severe malaria is a medical emergency and it is ideal to start the medication within 1 to 2 hours, certainly large referral centers or infectious disease referral centers likely will choose to keep the product. Other hospitals that potentially could see a severe malaria patient may not have seen any in the recent past. And so we have partnered with Cardinal Health as our third-party logistics, and I'm also putting agreements in place with all the other major wholesalers and some of the minor regional wholesalers. Additionally, we are looking at trying to place a number of consignment hospitals in key locations where we know that previous cases of severe malaria have occurred and been treated, with the goal to have the product available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, mm-hmm. across the entire country within 1 to 2 hours, with an outside absolute limit of 8 hours on the distribution, which falls within the median time of the time it's taken the CDC to get the product to their patients from the quarantine stations. And that's been an average of about 7 or 7.5 hours. And so that's the sort of outside limit we set as we're setting up our distribution network. Oh, that's great. Let's go ahead and switch gears to the drug itself, Artesunate for injection. What is it and how does it work?
So Artesunate is a member of the class of antimalarials called artemisinin, and it was discovered actually many hundreds of years ago in China and has been used in a number of therapeutic conditions, not just malaria. As part of the process to select Artesunate as a development candidate, a number of different artemisinin compounds were evaluated, and ultimately it ended up with the down selection to Artesunate as being the superior choice. So number one, it is chemically modified to be able to make it a little bit more water soluble so that it can be put into an intravenous formulation, which is obviously critical. And as a class of medicines, they are the class of medicines that will kill the malaria parasite the most rapidly. We know that for each dose, about a 10,000-fold reduction in the number of parasites within the body will occur, which is substantially faster than the other approved antimalarials. This is extremely important in severe malaria because, as I mentioned, very high degrees of parasitemia, in excess of 5% and sometimes many times more than that, may be a total percentage of the red blood cells within the patient's body may be parasitized. And so it's critical to get rid of those parasites as quickly as possible.
Now, is this IV drug, is it taken like standalone, or do you have to take it with oral drugs or any and other antimalarials? Or
that's an excellent and very important question. So during that initial treatment period, it's only necessary to use the IV artesunate. However, if one were to use only artesunate to treat the whole malaria case, even if one were to say treat for an entire week, there can be a very small number of a very early life stage of the parasite called early ring forms, which may go into a rather quiescent state, which then, when the drug pressure from the artesunate is removed, may be able to wake back up and reestablish the infection. So it's very important that clinicians and patients both understand that after the severe malaria requiring the intravenous treatment portion has passed, the patients need to complete a full course of another approved antimalarial to make sure that those last remaining bits of the malaria are also cured.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about the clinical trials and the approval process? I know that's a pretty long answer, but a summary?
Yeah, and quite different in this case because, as I mentioned, it's been used over 20 years around the world and is already the recognized standard of care.
Right.
And so because of that, there's a great deal of information in the literature, and that necessitated appropriately what's called a 505(b)(2) approach, which is a combined proprietary information of clinical trials, which the sponsor has done, combined with what's known in the literature. So in this case, there's two pivotal trials in severe malaria, one called Sequemat, which was in adults in Southeast Asia, one called Aquamat, which was in children in 11 sites throughout Africa. These were both conducted by the Wellcome Trust. Both showed significant decreases in all-cause mortality compared to the other approved standard of care, which was IV quinine. In addition to that, there are a number of clinical trials which filled in pieces from a developed world stringent regulatory authority perspective. Healthy volunteer studies evaluating the pharmacokinetics and the EKG changes that can be associated with drugs, as well as some dose ranging trials and things like that. So all of that together is what was the efficacy and safety portions of the dossier that were submitted to the U.S. FDA.
Yeah, and as I said in the introduction, it's for the treatment of severe malaria in adults and children. Can you elaborate on that at all?
So that's a really important thing to note in the label. Most severe malaria and the highest mortality is with the one subspecies, the Plasmodium falciparum. However, there are 5 species of human malaria, and several of them can cause severe malaria and can cause mortality. It's important to note that the initial treatment for any of those to kill those parasites as quickly as possible is IV artesunate. And you are correct. The overall risk-benefit is clearly in favor of using this medicine to substantially improve your chances of not dying And that goes from 1-month-old infants all the way through to geriatrics. That includes even pregnant women in all trimesters. Now, there is less known about how IV artesunate behaves in pregnancy, and particularly first trimester, and also some questions about the pharmacokinetics and dosing in very small infants, low body weights, particularly infants under 6 months of age. And so as part of the post-marketing requirements and commitments that we have negotiated with the FDA, there are ongoing studies and evaluations, particularly focusing on those two at-risk populations.
So Dr. Smith, what do we know about the adverse reactions? Are there any?
Well, certainly. All medications
Right.
have adverse reactions. And that is also an important question here. In general, IV artesunate is a very safe and well-tolerated medication. It is better tolerated and certainly easier to administer than the old standard of care, the IV quinine or the IV quinine. Does not cause the cardiac dysrhythmia problems or the very low blood glucose problems that can occur with those medications. But there is one unique aspect of treatment with artesunate, which is important for clinicians to understand. Because it can so rapidly kill the malaria parasites, and again, in some subjects, the degree of the percentage of their red blood cells that have been parasitized can be quite high. Artesunate is unique as far as we know in its ability not only just to kill that parasite, but it actually puts it into a state that it allows the parasite to be removed from the red blood cell by the spleen, but the red blood cell itself being retained in circulation. And that's critical, as you can imagine, for you continuing to be able to use the hemoglobin to get oxygen to the cells, which is probably part of the survival advantage. But those red blood cells are not normal, and because they were parasitized, there are changes in those red blood cells that make them more brittle, and their lifespan is not the same as a normal red blood cell. And so there are subjects who can have a secondary hemolysis that can occur a week and even up to a month after treatment with the IV artesunate. So it's critical that clinicians and patients understand that their disease of severe malaria is not over once the parasites are seen to have left their bloodstream, and they need to continue under doctor's care and continue to be followed, particularly as their blood counts. And occasionally the hemolysis is severe enough that patients have to return to the hospital and receive blood transfusion before their treatment for their severe malaria would be complete.
And what about resistance, Plasmodium resistance? Is there any known resistance to this drug?
So there are reports of artesunate resistance primarily stemming from Southeast Asia, and there are a number of efforts ongoing worldwide to continue to monitor for that. Fortunately, the reports of actual treatment failure associated with artemisinin resistance are really virtually unheard of at this point. It's usually a failure of that partner drug, the secondary drug which we were talking about. But this is certainly something that we will be monitoring, as will the FDA. And indeed, one of the post-marketing requirements that we have agreed and negotiated is continuing to work with international organizations that are monitoring for the development of artemisinin resistance, so that we would be able to get an early signal and read for that to develop. But at present, that really isn't a treatment decision or conundrum at this point, blessedly.
Good. That's good news. And lastly, Dr. Smith, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about the work of Amivas.
No, thank you very much. And again, we are so appreciative of your time and your interest. For me personally, my journey with malaria research, and Artesunate began over 15 years ago. And it just became absolutely crystal clear apparent that this drug was critically needed in the United States. And to not have the recognized global standard of care and the decreased mortality was a simply unacceptable alternative. And with only 300 patients per year in this ultra-orphan context, that may not seem like very many people in a big pharma context or to many, but to me, I absolutely could not quit until I was assured that we had made this therapy available to the subjects. And while it necessitated my walking away from my clinical practice, which I dearly loved, those 300 patients per year are more than I could save in an entire career as a family doc. Well, that passion and that understanding is what led to the formation of Amivas. So when it became clear that the U.S. Army's development efforts had stalled and they lost their co-development partner, we formed Amivas as what I will call a coalition of the willing to step in and meet this unmet need and fill this critical necessity. And so as part of that, we reached out and put the coalition together of people not only with deep knowledge and experience in tropical diseases, and particularly malaria, but also deep international regulatory and drug development expertise. We actually partnered with the manufacturer that had been producing the product for the U.S. Army that has been available through the CDC since 2007. That's Dalton Pharma Services in Toronto, Canada. And we also partnered as one of our major shareholders and board members with a specialty pharmacy company headquartered out of Sydney, Australia, called Febra Party Limited, who specializes in sterile injectables and critical medicine, needed medicines, particularly things like antivenoms, which are similar to IV artesunate for severe malaria in that while they're not needed all very frequently, when they are needed, they're critically needed. And so building a company with expertise in that and a company that can provide that 24/7 availability, absolutely ensuring that it is unacceptable and impossible for us to even contemplate something like a stock outage was really critical. And so those underpinnings are the reason that we formed, the reason that we do the work that we do, and the reason that we are continuing. So while first things first, which is to finish the work here in making it fully commercially available in the United States, following that, we will be continuing to evaluate areas around the world that we may be able to be a valuable partner with, bringing IV artesunate into the global supply in areas where it may not be widely available except through restricted special access schemes or named patient programs or things like that.
Well, that's good. And I'll go ahead and link to the Amivas website in the show notes when the podcast is published. And I want to thank you, Dr. Bryan Smith, for sharing your time and your expertise, and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, Mr. Harriman, very much. I enjoyed this.
Okay. Have a great day.